Hey guys, tonight we step off a creaking longboat and onto the sun-bleached edge of a continent that feels both empty and endless. You squint into a horizon trembling with heat, tasting salt on your lips and dust in your throat, and you immediately suspect that nothing you packed will behave the way you hoped, especially not the delicate baking supplies wedged between your boots and a tin of questionable salted beef. The sand shifts under your feet, and you have that familiar, slightly comic dread of realizing you probably won't survive this if your next loaf comes out as a brick. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward, the gritty wind tickling your cheeks as early Australian settlers bustle around you with a kind of exhausted optimism. They're unloading crates of flour that already look suspiciously lumpy, as though they've absorbed half the continent's humidity just from the voyage. One mainstream historical fact you register right away is this. Early European arrivals depended almost obsessively on flour. Bread was caloric comfort, a tie to home, and a fragile lifeline in a landscape they didn't yet understand. Still, as you watch a crate split open and spill pale powder across the sand, you notice that the wind is doing half the mixing for you, just not in a helpful way. You kneel into the warm, shifting soil and run a bit between your fingers. It's no surprise that settlers' first attempts at baking here were marked by disappointment. The environment influences everything, and this environment has opinions. The breeze steals heat from campfires, the soil gets into everything, and water sources fluctuate between brackish and alarmingly brackish. Yet, as quirky as it sounds, one fringe tidbit you learn early on is that some settlers swore a tiny bit of sand in their bread added texture. You suspect this was less culinary pride and more desperate positivity, but still points for morale. You're drawn toward a rough shelter that serves as the settlement's temporary kitchen. It's built of mismatched planks, canvas, and the collective willingness of a dozen tired people pretending they're experienced carpenters. Inside, a pot-bellied fire pit glows, and the smoky air hugs your clothing like a clingy pet. You step closer and spy a pile of the settlers' precious flour already being sifted to separate it from any stowaway weevils who made the voyage too. Nothing wakes you up like the thought of pests in your breakfast, though you remind yourself quietly that historians still argue whether early infestations were as rampant as personal letters suggest, or whether settlers were simply prone to a little dramatic flair. Nearby, a woman uses the edge of her sleeve to wipe sweat from her brow, muttering about the climate. You can relate. The heat makes you feel like your thoughts are gently melting, yet there's something soothing in the rhythm of her movements scoop, sift, shake, breathe as she works. Settlers learned quickly to bake at odd hours, often before dawn or after sunset, when the air felt less like a giant, judgmental oven. You're tempted to make the first of your light jokes and tell her she could market this as the original hot yoga bakery. But you keep that to yourself. For now, someone calls your name calls you, because narration rules are rules, and hands you an iron pan. You heft it, surprised. Everything here is heavy. The pots, the heat, the sky pressing down. If flour is the heart of their baking, then these rugged tools are the bones. You watch as a few settlers debate whether the remaining flour should be rationed into evenly sized loaves or saved for damper later in the week. They circle around the supplies like you've all stumbled into the world's driest, least strategic board game. Flour today or flour tomorrow? One of them jokes softly. Feels like choosing between eating and eating sooner? You laugh with them, a quiet puff of humor. Joke one, you think. A small win. As you step outside again, the air changes. The scent of eucalyptus drifts lazily toward you, reminding you how foreign this place must have felt to early arrivals. The birds overhead don't sound like anything you're used to. Even their calls seem to comment sarcastically on your baking ambitions. You can almost hear one saying, "Good luck getting yeast to rise in this heat, mate." You roll your eyes in an affectionate way, brushing aside a stray branch that's insistently poking at your shoulder. Joke 2. A few settlers gather around a makeshift table to plan their next bake. You join them, resting your elbows on the uneven plank wood. They speculate about how the climate will affect their dough today, and one mutters that if you leave it out too long, it might just walk away. You grin at that joke 3 and tuck the image away for later storytelling purposes. But beneath the humor, there's a real lesson unfolding. Baking is not just cooking here, it's adaptation, it's patience, it's learning to read the environment as much as reading a recipe. As the day nudges closer to sunset, you take a long, slow breath and feel the temperature finally begin to drop. The dust settles. The settlement becomes quiet except for the rustling of trees and the low crackle of early evening fires. And here, in the gentle dim, you begin to understand why the settlers clung to baking. Bread meant warmth. Bread meant familiarity. Bread meant a small, edible triumph in a land that routinely shrugged at their efforts. You loosen your shoulders and glance once more at the flour crates, humble, stubborn, essential. Sand might sneak into your dough. The wind might toy with your fire. Water might taste like it was filtered through a bored crocodile. Yet tonight, the first loaves will rise, however imperfectly. And so do you? Just a little. You trudge across the red dust, the settling sun casting long shadows of uneven huts, and your attention drifts toward the small, improvised ovens dotting the settlement. They're heavy, lumpy shapes of iron, brick, and mud, each one unique as a thumbprint, each one promising warmth and disappointment in equal measure. Historians still argue whether settlers deliberately made ovens portable for flexibility or simply built what their exhausted minds could manage, but, right now, it doesn't matter. You just need one to survive your evening's bake. The first thing that strikes you is the weight. Iron pots, some bigger than your head, rest precariously over smoldering embers. You lift one, pretending it's lighter than it is, and feel your arms tremble ever so slightly. Settlers had to learn the delicate balance between fire and metal, a dance where too much heat burned the crust and too little left the interior gummy. You notice a faint glow from coals and inhale the smoky sweetness. It smells like wood and patience, with a hint of desperation. One oven, cobbled together from old iron sheets, behaves unpredictably. You tap it gently and hear a hollow clang, the sound echoing like a bell in the quiet bush. This is where settlers discovered a fringe but oddly comforting fact. A rattling oven sometimes meant the bread inside would rise better. You raise an eyebrow, wondering if this is superstition, science, or somewhere in between. You tuck the thought away, a gentle question mark for later. As you kneel to stoke the fire, you notice the layers of ash and sand inside the pit. They act as insulation, holding heat steadily but unpredictably. You stir embers with a branch, sending sparks dancing lazily into the dusky sky. The fire's warmth spreads to your knees and fingers, a reminder that these ovens are not just cooking tools, they're companions in a world that doesn't make life easy. Settlers learned to judge a fire by sound, sight, and even smell, an unspoken language that you now try to decipher. Nearby, a man sprinkles flour onto a flat iron sheet, preparing to slide in a fresh batch of damper. You watch the dough carefully, noticing the small air pockets forming as it bakes. A quirky detail emerges. Some settlers added tiny twigs or leaves into the dough to keep it from sticking, which occasionally left faint imprints resembling abstract art. It's an unintentional aesthetic, and you smile, imagining future generations mistaking this for culinary genius rather than necessity. The heat rises slowly, licking your face with gentle insistence. You wipe sweat from your brow and lean back, feeling the comforting monotony of tending fires. It's oddly hypnotic, the repetitive motions, the soft crackle of burning wood, the smell of cooking bread mixing with dry earth. You think about how settlers must have felt, learning that patience mattered more than precision. Every loaf was a small gamble, a quiet victory, or a humble failure. You glance at the other ovens scattered across the settlement. Some are simple iron cauldrons tipped over open fires, Others are brick and clay contraptions, carefully leveled and lined with sand. Each has its rhythm. You remember that settlers sometimes used crocodile dung as a makeshift fuel in extreme scarcity, though historians still argue whether this was widespread practice or just whispered rumor. You don't dwell too long on it, you just note it with mild fascination and continue tending your ember. Settlers discovered over time that the ambient temperature mattered as much as the oven's design. A gust of wind could cool one side of the oven enough to ruin a batch. You shift the coals and experiment with placement, observing how heat circulates and dough responds. You're learning the lessons of empirical baking, the kind that doesn't require a cookbook-only observation, intuition, and the occasional forgiving laugh at your own mistakes. A woman nearby hums a lullaby as she checks her loaves. You lean closer and realize the tune has a calming effect on both her and the bread. It's not magical, just psychologically soothing, but that gentle rhythm is contagious. You start moving more deliberately, almost meditatively, stoking fires, adjusting trays, and monitoring heat with quiet attention. You realize why settlers treated their ovens like sacred objects. They were repositories of hope, warmth, and survival. By late afternoon, the ovens reach optimal temperature. You slide a loaf into one of the iron cauldrons and watch as it begins to puff, bubbles forming on its surface. It's mesmerizing, the slow, deliberate transformation of simple flour and water into sustenance. A fringe tidbit from settler diaries floats through your mind. Some claim that whispering a few words to the dough helped it rise. You chuckle softly. Even if it's nonsense, the ritual seems to ease nerves, and that counts for something. The sky deepens to a muted red, shadows stretching across the settlement, and you feel a sense of calm settle over the ovens. You monitor the heat carefully, shifting coals here and there, turning loaves gently. Each move is deliberate, almost ceremonial, a tactile meditation in the fading light. You notice how the simple act of baking, once fraught with anxiety, now feels rhythmic, grounding, and oddly cozy. Settlers had to invent solutions constantly. They discovered that lining ovens with wet clay could reduce scorching, that certain twigs produced a gentler smoke, and that keeping coals on one side allowed for a slow, even bake. You replicate these small tricks, feeling the gentle satisfaction of minor triumphs. Historians still argue whether early settlers fully understood these techniques scientifically or just learned through trial and error. You decide it hardly matters. Knowledge passed down through experience is knowledge all the same. The final loaves emerge golden, imperfectly round, but with a soft aroma that fills the hut. You gently lift one from the iron sheet and inhale its warmth, imagining how settlers must have felt victory in a world that otherwise seems indifferent. You remember the first sandy flour crate and the fear of a ruined bake, and now you marvel at the subtle triumph in simple survival. The sun dips below the horizon, and the ovens continue to radiate warmth. You step back, dusting your hands, and allow yourself a quiet smile. The settlers' ingenuity, patience, and gentle humor echo around the red earth, whispering through the scent of baking bread. You feel a gentle fatigue, the kind that comes from productive, mindful effort, and you realize that tending an oven in the early colony was about more than food. It was about creating small pockets of comfort in an uncertain world. You sit back on the edge of a low wooden crate, letting your fingers trail through the fine dust settling around the ovens, and your attention drifts to a small sack of wattle seeds resting nearby. They're tiny, nutty, and almost unassuming. But in the hands of early settlers, these seeds represented both innovation and experimentation. You pick one up and roll it between your fingers, noting the faintly bitter aroma. Settlers discovered that wattle seeds could be ground into a coarse flour, adding texture and protein to otherwise monotonous loaves. Historians still argue whether this adaptation was truly widespread or limited to a handful of adventurous cooks, but you can't help but admire the ingenuity. You measure a small spoonful of wattle flour and fold it into your dough. The texture changes immediately, slightly grainy, earthy, and nutty, reminiscent of a toasted cereal but more understated. Fringe evidence suggests some settlers added a pinch of salt or even a sprinkle of ash to the dough to balance the flavor, a practice that makes you pause and sniff cautiously before continuing. You chuckle softly, imagining future bakers looking at your loaf and wondering what mysterious ash ingredient inspired it. Joke 1. The process requires patience. Wattle flour absorbs moisture differently from wheat, so you slowly incorporate water, feeling the dough shift from stiff to pliable. You notice how your hands get coated, a gentle layer of flour clinging to skin and nails. The tactile sensation is oddly satisfying, almost meditative, and you can see why settlers became attached to the act of kneading. Each motion is deliberate, repetitive, soothing a form of quiet comfort in the harsh, sun-baked settlement. You glance around at other settlers experimenting with the seeds. One woman folds hers into a sweetened dough, adding a drizzle of treacle salvaged from a crate. Another mixes the seeds into damper for her family, claiming the nutty flavor is more filling during long walks to the creek. You note how these micro-innovations reveal the settlers' practical creativity. Small adjustments, minor experiments, quiet triumphs. Historians still debate whether these methods originated from indigenous advice or pure settler trial and error, but either way, the results are unexpectedly pleasant. As the wattle dough rests, you take a moment to reflect on the sensory environment. The sun has softened to a gentle apricot glow, and the smell of baking bread mingles with dry eucalyptus and the faint tang of creek water. The air feels warm but not stifling, the kind of atmosphere that invites slow, deliberate movements. You observe a crow in the distance, hopping from fence post to fence post as if overseeing your culinary efforts. You quietly joke to yourself, joke too, that even the birds have higher expectations than you do. Returning to your dough, you begin kneading in earnest. The seeds add a subtle resistance, a kind of gentle friction that makes the rhythm of folding and stretching more satisfying. You can imagine settlers learning these motions over months or years, hands becoming instinctive instruments of survival and comfort. Fringe accounts even suggest that some settlers would hum or quietly speak to the dough, a soft encouragement that may have been more about easing tension than magical efficacy. You hum along faintly, feeling a shared, soothing rhythm. You divide the dough into small portions, shaping each with careful hands. Settlers had to judge size by experience rather than measuring tools. Too small, and the loaves dried out; too large, and they failed to cook properly. You watch one loaf rise unevenly, a tiny hill in the center, and grin at the imperfection. Joke 3. Perfection wasn't the goal here, sustenance and warmth were, and somehow that made even these misshapen loaves endearing. You prepare a small fire nearby, arranging embers for gentle, even heat. The process is delicate. Too much heat, and the wattle-enhanced dough scorches. Too little, and it remains dense and chewy. You remember that early settlers often baked by trial and error, observing changes in color, smell, and texture. Each bake is a lesson in the dialogue between ingredients, environment, and human patience. Historians still argue whether such knowledge was passed down formally or existed primarily in informal observation. But from where you kneel, it feels universal and intimate. Sliding the dough onto a flat iron sheet, you position it over coals that radiate warmth without aggression. The aroma of toasting seeds mingles with the subtle scent of flour, creating a soft, comforting perfume. You inhale deeply, feeling the tension of the day ease from your shoulders. Settlers often describe these moments as quiet victories, small yet meaningful. You imagine a woman pulling a loaf from the heat and pressing it into her child's hands, eyes weary but satisfied. The notion that food is also an emotional balm strikes you as gently profound. As the loaves begin to bake, a golden crust forming slowly, you note the subtle variations in texture and aroma. Wattle seeds create a lightly gritty surface, a gentle crunch contrasting with a soft interior. Fringe accounts suggest some settlers believed this texture helped extend freshness, though historians still debate its efficacy. You don't mind; what matters is the comfort in process and outcome. The sun dips lower, and the surrounding landscape softens in hue. Settlers continue their quiet work, adjusting fires, checking dough, and whispering minor advice to each other. You settle into a rhythm of observation, kneading, and tending the heat, feeling the meditative quality of the activity. In this small, makeshift kitchen, surrounded by iron and dust and red earth, you sense the heart of early Australian settlement, resilience, subtle innovation, and a gentle humor that makes even sandy loaves feel like triumphs. You step back from your warm, wattle seed loaves and notice a small group of settlers gathered near a low mound of earth, shaping what appears to be a rudimentary oven. This is where you first see the borrowed indigenous techniques in action, an adaptation of earth oven methods used by local Aboriginal communities. You watch as they carefully dig a shallow pit, line it with heated stones, and cover it with leaves and soil to trap warmth. Historians still argue whether settlers fully understood the ceremonial aspects behind these methods or simply adopted the practical mechanics, but the result is undeniably effective. A slow, consistent heat that transforms dough into edible comfort. You kneel beside the pit, feeling the rough texture of sand and dirt under your fingers. The settlers have learned a subtle lesson from the land. Moisture content in the soil affects heat retention. Too dry, and the bread scorches. Too damp, and it becomes soggy. You gently pat the earth, imagining the trial and error sessions that led to this quiet mastery. A fringe detail emerges. Some settlers added charred leaves from certain shrubs to infuse a subtle flavor into the bread, a practice that feels oddly gourmet despite its humble origins. The aroma rising from the pit is gentle and almost hypnotic. You inhale deeply and feel a slow, calming rhythm take hold, as if the earth itself is whispering reassurance. Settlers often describe these moments as a connection to the land, a subtle grounding in a landscape that could otherwise feel overwhelming. You watch as a small, neatly shaped damper is nestled into the pit, covered with soil, and left to bake in the residual heat. There's patience in this method, no rushing, no peering over the oven constantly, just trust in the slow, quiet process. Nearby, a woman chats softly with a child, explaining how the heat from stones and earth cooks the bread evenly. You note the almost ritualistic care in their movements, a testament to the settlers' respect for a technique that wasn't originally theirs. Fringe anecdotes suggest some settlers even decorated their loaves with leaf patterns before baking, a small, playful echo of indigenous artistry. You smile at the thought, appreciating the gentle blending of cultural knowledge. You step aside to check on your own iron pot oven. The loaves inside are golden, bubbling slightly along the edges, and the smell is comforting, grounding. The interplay between borrowed techniques and European methods fascinates you. Settlers were neither purely imitating nor entirely inventing. They were negotiating with their environment and the wisdom around them, finding a balance between familiarity and innovation. Historians still argue about the degree of indigenous influence, but from where you kneel in the soft dusk, it feels beautifully collaborative. A faint breeze rustles nearby leaves, and you notice how small shifts in air circulation affect both ovens and dough. The bush is alive with these subtle interactions, almost conversational in its own right. Settlers had to read these signs attentively, an early form of environmental literacy that seems effortless in hindsight, but demanded patience and observation in reality. Fringe accounts even note that some early bakers would pause mid-knead to feel the wind on their faces, interpreting its warmth or chill as guidance for timing the next step. You lean back and feel a small smile creep across your face at this gentle, human-scale intelligence. Your attention returns to the pit oven, and you notice the loaves slowly rising beneath their earthen cover. There's a quiet magic in this transformation. Flour and water, sun-warmed stones, and careful hands becoming sustenance. You remember the heavy iron ovens and wonder which method feels more meditative. Both have charmed the sturdy predictability of metal and the tender cooperation with the earth. But this one carries a certain intimacy, a whispered understanding between the settlers and the land. You check the timing, a skill refined over weeks and months. Each loaf has a slightly different cooking duration depending on its size, the depth of covering, and the subtle warmth radiating from the stones. You gently adjust one loaf, realizing that even minor movements can make a difference. It's a tactile negotiation with the environment, where observation and gentle intervention matter more than strict measurement. Historians still argue about the exact recipes and proportions used, but you feel that here, in this quiet dusk, precision gives way to intuition. Settlers gather in small clusters, discussing texture, aroma, and doneness. You overhear someone remark on how the slow cooking produces a velvety crumb, and another nodding in agreement. Fringe accounts suggest that some settlers claim to feel a heartbeat in the dough, a poetic way of noting its readiness. You smile at the imagery and fold it gently into your awareness. Joke 1. As the evening deepens, the pit ovens emit a comforting heat that spreads across your skin. You kneel and feel the rhythm of the settlement settling into calm fires, crackling, soft laughter, the occasional whisper of wind, and the low murmur of rising bread. This borrowed knowledge, this quiet collaboration between settlers and indigenous practice, is not flashy or spectacular. It's gentle, reliable, and quietly transformative. Joke 2. By the time the loaves are retrieved, golden and slightly earthy in flavor, you feel a sense of calm satisfaction. Settlers' cautious adaptations, their patient attention to earth, fire, and flour have yielded sustenance and comfort. You gently brush off stray grains, inhaling the soft, nutty aroma that rises. In this simple, quiet moment, you appreciate how much thought, care, and subtle innovation underpin what might otherwise seem like a mundane task. Historians still argue whether settlers truly understood the science behind these methods, but in practice, the outcome is undeniable: warmth, food, and a gentle rhythm to close the day. You take a slow breath, letting the soft, smoky aroma of the pit ovens mingle with the lingering scent of wattle seed loaves, and your mind drifts toward one of the trickier challenges of early settlement baking: the scarcity of milk and butter. You can feel the tension settlers must have experienced, the delicate balance between wanting rich, comforting bread and having only the barest substitutes at hand. Mainstream historical records tell us that dairy production was sporadic, unreliable, and often limited to small herds. Settlers sometimes relied on powdered milk or diluted milk left over from previous days, and butter was a rare luxury, carefully rationed or improvised with rendered animal fats. Historians still argue whether the substitution methods were more a matter of necessity or ingenuity, but you're about to see both in action firsthand. You kneel by a small makeshift table, watching a woman pour a thin liquid into a mound of flour. The mixture is lumpy, unpredictable, and oddly mesmerizing. You notice how her hands fold and push the dough with deliberate care, coaxing it to accept the liquid without collapsing. A fringe tidbit emerges. Some settlers found that adding a small amount of tree sap, usually from gum trees, could mimic the elasticity that butter would normally provide. You raise an eyebrow at this, tentatively fold in a drop, and marvel at the subtle chemistry at work. The dough is sticky and soft, and you find yourself kneading it slowly, almost meditatively. The repetitive motion press, fold, stretch, is oddly soothing, a tactile rhythm that seems to echo the surrounding bush. You hear the distant call of a kookaburra, the faint murmur of a creek, and the soft rustle of eucalyptus leaves. It's the kind of sensory environment that early settlers learned to work with rather than against, and you realize how much of baking in this era was negotiation with circumstance. You notice that substitutes for butter sometimes leave a faint, unexpected aroma, slightly smoky or tangy, depending on the source. Some settlers describe this as characterful bread, a gentle way of accepting imperfections as part of daily life. Fringe accounts even suggest that certain fats were thought to bring warmth to the dough, almost as if they were imbuing it with energy. You quietly smile, imagining a weary baker attributing mystical qualities to melted fat. Joke 1. As you fold and knead, you recall letters from settlers describing their first attempts at dairy-free pastries. The texture was unpredictable, sometimes dense and chewy, other times surprisingly light. These early experiments taught patience. Every loaf required careful attention to moisture, heat, and timing. You sense that settlers became adept at reading subtle cues in their dough, a slight wobble indicating too much liquid, a stubborn firmness suggesting the need for a gentle touch. Historians still debate how standardized these techniques ever became, but you feel that this hands-on learning was as important as any recipe. A small girl approaches with a measuring cup, carrying diluted milk carefully from a nearby trough. You guide her hands gently, helping her pour without spilling. Children often assisted with tasks like this, learning tactile skills and patience early. Fringe observations suggest that girls and boys developed distinct roles, some focused on kneading, others on fetching ingredients or maintaining fire. You watch her concentration and can't help but smile. Her dedication mirrors your own focus on the dough. Joke 2. You pour a trickle of melted animal fat into another portion of dough, noticing how it changes texture instantly. The stickiness eases, and the dough becomes more pliable. Settlers discovered these small modifications through experimentation, slowly building an intuitive understanding of their ingredients. You fold in the fat carefully, feeling the dough respond. There's a subtle joy in witnessing these small, deliberate transformations, a quiet satisfaction that comes from creating something nourishing from limited resources. Evening approaches, and the soft amber light casts gentle shadows across the settlement. The smell of cooking bread mingles with the faint tang of eucalyptus and damp earth, creating a comforting sensory cocoon. You step back to observe all the small improvisations in play. Diluted milk, rendered fats, wattle seeds, pit ovens, iron cauldrons. Each is a testament to human creativity, persistence, and adaptability. Historians still argue about which methods were most effective or widespread, but in this quiet moment, effectiveness is measured by warmth, sustenance, and a sense of accomplishment. You slide the prepared loaves into an iron pot, adjusting the embers to provide gentle, even heat. The transformation is slow. The dough rises, bubbles appear, the crust forms with subtle irregularities that hint at both scarcity and ingenuity. Fringe accounts mention that some settlers whispered softly to their dough, a ritual that may have calmed their own nerves as much as anything else. You hum quietly to yourself, enjoying the shared rhythm. Joke 3. As the first scent of golden, butterless loaves fills the air, you lean back and take a moment to absorb the scene. The early Australian settlers faced a daily reality of improvisation, scarcity, and constant learning. Yet, through it all, their simple, cozy baking methods offered comfort, sustenance, and a gentle connection to the land. You inhale the aroma one last time, letting the warmth of the oven and the slow rhythm of baking settle over you, and feel the subtle satisfaction that comes from creating something both humble and sustaining. You walk slowly among the low huts and scattered ovens, letting the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight wash over the settlement, and your gaze falls upon a small stack of clay pots resting near a drying rack. These weren't just any pots, they were carefully preserved, thick-walled vessels meant for baking flatbreads and small puddings. Mainstream historical sources tell us that settlers often repurposed household items for cooking, combining necessity with ingenuity. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of clay pots reflected a conscious borrowing from indigenous methods or simply a pragmatic solution born from limited resources, but from where you stand, their utility is undeniable. You pick up a slightly warped pot and feel its warmth lingering from earlier use. A fringe tidbit reveals that some settlers experimented with covering the pots with leaves to retain moisture, a subtle innovation that created a soft, almost steamed texture inside the bread. You smile at the thought, imagining a casual experiment turning into a quietly effective technique, one that probably never made it into formal cookbooks but left an indelible mark on daily life. Kneeling near a small hearth, you begin preparing a dough for one of the pots. The texture is soft, pliable, yet a little stubborn, and you notice how small variations in humidity affect the mixture. You push, fold, and stretch it, feeling the tactile rhythm work its calming magic. There's a meditative quality to this labor, repetitive, absorbing, grounding. Fringe accounts even suggest some settlers would hum songs to encourage steady kneading, a gentle ritual that may have soothed both dough and baker alike. You slide the dough into a clay pot, lining it carefully with a thin cloth to prevent sticking. The smell of slightly toasted flour rises as the pot settles over a low fire. You notice the faint crackle of embers beneath it, the subtle warmth radiating through the clay, and the comforting promise of sustenance slowly taking shape. Settlers often describe this process as tending the bread's soul, a phrase you find charming and oddly fitting. Nearby, another baker is experimenting with a puddings-like mixture of flour, water, and small foraged berries. The aroma is faintly sweet, earthy, and intriguing. Fringe evidence suggests some early settlers used these puddings as both dessert and a source of nutrition, sometimes adding crushed seeds for extra texture. You watch them carefully fold the mixture into the pot, thinking about the gentle inventiveness required to make scarce ingredients feel abundant. You notice that maintaining consistent heat is a delicate dance. The clay pots absorb and radiate warmth differently than iron, which means coals need constant adjustment. Too much heat, and the dough scorches. Too little, and it remains undercooked. You feel your attention sharpen, mindful of subtle visual cues, a slight color change, a soft bubble forming, the faint aroma signaling near readiness. Historians still debate whether settlers achieved mastery or relied largely on luck and instinct, but you find yourself appreciating the careful observation required. A small group gathers nearby to watch the process, some adjusting coals, others whispering advice or lightly teasing each other. You notice the gentle camaraderie, the shared knowledge passed through demonstration rather than text. Fringe accounts suggest that settlers sometimes left a small mark on each baked item, an unspoken signature of craftsmanship, a tiny flourish in an otherwise utilitarian practice. You smile at the idea, recognizing the human need to leave subtle traces, even in bread. As the dough in the clay pot begins to firm, the aroma deepens, filling the small space with warmth. You check the pot's base, careful not to disturb its fragile balance. Settlers learn to rotate or tilt vessels to ensure even cooking, a small, almost imperceptible adjustment that could make the difference between a chewy loaf and one perfectly soft throughout. You mimic their motions, feeling the rhythm settle into your body, a tactile meditation in slow motion. Outside, the air softens as the sun dips lower, and the gentle chirping of insects begins to fill the spaces between human activity. You take a moment to pause, inhaling the mingling scents of baked bread, dry earth, and eucalyptus. The settlement feels alive yet serene, the combination of gentle labor, slow cooking, and ambient sounds creating a kind of sleepy harmony. Joke 1. You carefully lift the lid of the clay pot, revealing the bread inside. Its surface is golden, slightly cracked in places, and you can see the soft texture waiting beneath. Fringe observers claim that some settlers would tap the bottom of pots to judge doneness, listening for a hollow note. You try it yourself and marvel at how these subtle techniques became tools of intuition rather than strict measurement. Settlers often relied on such improvisational knowledge, blending observation, experience, and small innovations. Historians still debate how much of this was learned from indigenous communities versus European tradition, but in practice, these methods create a quiet, almost hypnotic rhythm of survival. You slide the bread out carefully, inhaling its warmth and letting the day's effort settle over you in a gentle, satisfying way. You step back from the clay pots and glance at the line of small makeshift tables scattered across the settlement, each holding bowls of ingredients, scraps of leftover flour, and tiny bundles of foraged herbs. The smell of baked bread lingers in the air, mingling with faint hints of wild rosemary and native mint. Settlers often incorporated these herbs into their dough, not only for flavor, but also as a subtle preservative, a practice that seems oddly comforting now in your quiet observation. Historians still argue whether the use of herbs was widespread or limited to those with access to foraged greenery, but the aroma tells its own story: care, attention, and small pleasures in the daily grind. You kneel at one of the tables, picking up a handful of chopped rosemary to fold gently into a dough. The soft texture feels almost playful in your hands, and you notice the earthy scent rising as you press and stretch. Fringe tidbits from settler diaries suggest that certain herbs were chosen for their soothing qualities, an almost poetic attempt to infuse calm into bread, and you can't help but admire the subtle mindfulness behind it. You gently fold the herbs in, imagining the tiny acts of care that may have gone unnoticed but carried great meaning. Nearby, a woman is experimenting with a combination of foraged herbs and a pinch of wattle seed flour. You watch her movements carefully. A scoop here, a fold there, hands working in a quiet rhythm. Settlers often had to balance experimentation with limited supplies, a gentle negotiation between curiosity and necessity. Historians still debate whether these combinations were intentional culinary innovations or happy accidents, but the results are undeniably aromatic and subtly flavorful. You notice how the texture of the dough responds differently with the addition of herbs. The surface becomes slightly uneven, tiny pockets forming where the oils from the herbs mingle with flour and water. You run your fingers over it, appreciating the tactile variation. Fringe anecdotes even suggest some settlers whispered little encouragements to their dough, perhaps unconsciously transferring their own patience and care into the mixture. Joke 1. The sun continues its slow descent, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and pink. You adjust a nearby iron oven, stoking embers gently, and placing a dough-filled tray inside. Settlers quickly learned that different dough compositions required careful calibration of heat. Too much embers and the delicate herbs scorched, releasing bitter notes. Too little and the dough failed to rise evenly. You find yourself absorbed in the slow, deliberate dance between heat, dough, and scent, a quiet meditation that seems to echo the settlers' own experiences. You step over to a small collection of puddings cooking in clay vessels, their surfaces rising slowly, flecked with herbs and tiny seeds. The smell is faintly sweet, earthy, and comforting. Fringe evidence indicates that some settlers believed that certain herbs not only flavored bread, but also brought mild warmth to the stomach, a kind of subtle wellness, though historians still debate the veracity of such claims. You inhale gently, letting the aroma settle into your senses, feeling a soft calm creep over you. A small child approaches carrying a cup of water, which you help pour slowly into another bowl of flour. Settlers often involve children in baking chores, partly out of necessity and partly as hands-on learning. You smile at the cooperative effort, observing the way tiny fingers carefully measure, mix, and fold. The act becomes a gentle rhythm, the sound of whispering and shuffling feet blending with the soft crackle of embers. Fringe observations suggest that some settlers taught children to recognize subtle visual cues in dough as early as 6 or 7, fostering intuition over rote instruction. Returning to your iron oven, you observe the dough beginning to change, its surface slightly golden and small bubbles appearing along the edges. Settlers often judge doneness by these visual cues, supplemented by the faint smell and occasional tapping of the base. Historians still debate the reliability of these informal techniques, but in practice, they worked well enough to feed families and communities. You run your fingers along the edge of a tray, feeling a comforting warmth radiate upward, reminding you that these simple processes were about much more than sustenance, they were rituals of reassurance. You pause to watch a gentle breeze ripple through the leaves above. The air carries a soft mix of eucalyptus, baking bread, and faint smoke from iron ovens. Settlers learned to read these subtle cues. The wind's direction, temperature, and moisture affected dough behavior and cooking times. You adjust your pot slightly, experimenting with placement, feeling a meditative satisfaction as you harmonize with the elements. Joke 2. By evening, the aroma of baked bread, herbs, and warming dough has settled into a soothing backdrop. You gently remove the herb-infused loaves from the oven, brushing off stray flour and noticing the subtle golden crust flecked with green. The effort, patience, and small innovations of the settlers become tangible here in your hands. Historians still argue about the exact recipes used, but the practice's enduring charm lies in its careful, gentle improvisation and the quiet, cozy rituals that sustained daily life. You step back and breathe in the calm evening air, letting the lingering aroma of freshly baked bread mingle with the faint scent of smoke and earth. Your gaze drifts toward a small collection of settlers gathered near a low wooden table, each holding scraps of dough and small, irregular lumps of what looks like dried fruit. Mainstream historical sources note that settlers often relied on dried or preserved fruits in their baking, an improvisation born of necessity and clever foresight. Historians still argue whether these additions were primarily nutritional or meant to introduce novelty, but you can almost hear the gentle satisfaction in their quiet murmurs as they fold berries and raisins into dough. You kneel to inspect the process, noticing how the fruit is first rinsed, then lightly mashed to release just enough moisture to blend smoothly with the flour. Fringe accounts mention that some settlers would soak fruits in diluted spirits to enhance flavor and texture, though not all families had access to such luxuries. You gently fold a small portion of berry into your dough, marveling at how the texture subtly shifts, slightly sticky yet pliable, and the faintly sweet aroma teases your senses. Nearby, a young boy carefully measures a pinch of sugar, the crystals catching the soft light. Settlers often rationed sugar carefully, making small portions last for weeks. You watch him sprinkle it over the dough, then fold gently, feeling the repetitive, calming rhythm of mixing and kneading. Joke 1. The tactile engagement seems to ease the entire group, an almost meditative counterpoint to the day's labor. You notice that the berries create small pockets of juice within the dough, a delicate surprise that early bakers learned to anticipate. Too much moisture could slow rising, too little, and the flavor remained muted. Settlers became attuned to these subtleties over time, learning through observation and hands-on trial. Historians still debate the precise techniques used, but from where you kneel, intuition seems to outweigh formal instruction. A woman leans over to adjust a tray in an iron oven, careful to avoid spilling any of the precious fruit-filled dough. Fringe details suggest that some settlers even wrapped individual loaves in leaves to preserve moisture and protect delicate fruits during baking. You watch her handle each piece with care, imagining how these subtle touches reflected not just resourcefulness but affection, a small tenderness woven into daily labor. The sun dips further, and a soft, golden haze settles over the settlement. You gently press your hands into your dough, feeling the warmth and pliability shift as you fold it over itself. The interplay between fruit, flour, and water feels almost like a slow dance, each component responding to the other with gentle compliance. Fringe observers noted that some bakers would hum quietly during these moments, a soothing accompaniment for both hands and dough. Joke 2. You slide a fruit-filled loaf into a clay pot, adjusting coals around it to ensure even heat. Settlers quickly learned that irregular heat could yield uneven cooking, particularly with the addition of fruit. You carefully monitor the process, feeling the soft heat radiating upward, comforting and steady. The scent of baked berries begins to mix with the earthy aroma of clay and the faint smoke from embers, creating a uniquely calming sensory experience. Nearby, another baker is shaping smaller, individual loaves. You watch her hands fold dough with meticulous care, pinching edges gently to encase berries. Settlers learned over time that careful sealing prevented juices from leaking, preserving both flavor and texture. Historians still argue how universally this technique was applied, but the practical results are clear. Fruit pockets remain intact, the bread rises evenly, and the aroma is unexpectedly luxurious given the sparse ingredients. You pause to take in the scene, the quiet movements, the gentle chatter, the soft golden light, and the smell of warm, fruity bread. Settlers' hands work rhythmically, their attention absorbed in the tactile meditation of kneading, folding, and shaping. Fringe anecdotes suggest that some bakers would taste tiny scraps, sharing them quietly among family members, a small ritual that celebrated effort and taste simultaneously. By the time the loaves emerge, golden brown and gently puffed, you feel a deep, calm satisfaction. The early settlers' improvisations with fruit, their careful attention to heat, texture, and moisture, create not just sustenance, but a cozy, comforting experience. Historians still debate the prevalence of such techniques, but the quiet joy and gentle humor in these small acts are undeniable, leaving a subtle warmth in both body and spirit. The evening deepens, and the soft glow of embers casts long, wavering shadows across the settlement. You wander toward a cluster of low tables, where settlers have begun experimenting with the subtler art of seasoning their dough. Mainstream historical records note that early Australian settlers often relied on local botanicals, like native pepperberry or wattle seed, to add flavor to otherwise plain bread. Historians still argue whether these additions were primarily pragmatic or a form of culinary creativity, but the gentle aromas drifting through the air suggest both. You kneel beside a woman who is carefully grinding wattle seeds with a small stone pestle. The powder is fine and nutty, releasing a subtle fragrance as it falls into a bowl of flour. Fringe tidbits reveal that some settlers believed wattle seeds could warm the belly or provide a mild sense of energy, a poetic idea more than a scientific claim, though you can almost feel the comforting suggestion in the aroma itself. You fold the seeds into the dough, noting the slight change in texture and color, a muted golden flecking that hints at a hidden richness. Nearby, a man crushes dried native pepperberries, scattering their tiny crimson fragments across dough. The scent is subtle, slightly spicy, and oddly soothing in the quiet evening air. Fringe accounts suggest that some settlers even used pepperberries to deter small insects during baking, a practical side effect of their culinary experimentations. You smile as you press your fingers gently into the dough, enjoying the combined texture of flour, seeds, and spice. Joke 1. The settlers work with a kind of gentle rhythm, folding, kneading, and rolling their dough into neat shapes. You notice the soft hissing of embers and the occasional whisper of wind through nearby shrubs, the ambient sounds blending into a slow, calming cadence. Historians still debate the extent to which settlers consciously incorporated indigenous knowledge versus improvising independently, but the result is a quietly intricate understanding of their environment. You slide a wattle seed loaf into a low clay oven, covering it carefully with leaves to trap heat and moisture. The transformation begins slowly. The dough rises imperceptibly, small pockets form, and the aroma deepens into something soft and earthy. Fringe observations note that some bakers would gently tap the crust with a finger to test for readiness, listening for a hollow note or subtle firmness, an early form of sensory mastery that modern cooks might appreciate in silence. A small child sits nearby, shaping tiny rolls with flour-streaked fingers. Settlers often involve children in these tasks, teaching tactile skills, patience, and attention to subtle cues. You watch the child press and fold, their movements tentative yet deliberate, and you feel a warm connection to the continuity of human experience in this quiet, domestic craft. Fringe sources suggest that children sometimes improvise small decorations on loaves, leaving tiny leaf impressions or crude patterns, a playful addition that brought lightheartedness to the routine. The sun dips lower, casting a rosy hue across the settlement, and you notice the interplay between fading light and the glow of the ovens. Settlers relied on such environmental cues for baking, warmth, light, and air circulation, subtly affecting timing and texture. You adjust a clay pot slightly, letting the residual heat from embers gently caress the dough, appreciating the meditative patience required. Joke 2. You pause to inhale deeply, the mingling sense of nutty wattle, faint pepper, and warm dough creating a hypnotically comforting olfactory landscape. Settlers' experiments with seasoning illustrate their quiet creativity, transforming basic ingredients into subtle pleasures. Historians still argue about which plants were most commonly used, but the gentle aroma alone tells a story of curiosity and careful observation. A loaf emerges, golden brown with flecks of nutty seed and a faint blush from crushed pepperberries. You feel a small, contented satisfaction, noting how the settlers' gentle improvisations and attention to detail yield a product both nourishing and comforting. The process is slow, tactile, and oddly meditative, an intimate interaction between human hands, environment, and time. By the time the wattle seed and pepperberry loaves are removed from the ovens, the quiet settlement feels cocooned in warmth, scent, and soft camaraderie. These subtle baking experiments, guided by observation, intuition, and a sprinkling of playful ingenuity, provide more than sustenance. They offer a soothing, gentle rhythm to the day, a kind of understated, edible meditation that settles the mind as well as the body. Night has begun to fall, and a delicate hush blankets the settlement. You notice the soft glow from embers reflecting off iron ovens and clay pots, the gentle heat radiating outward as the cool evening air creeps in. You kneel near a small wooden table where settlers are carefully measuring small amounts of salt and sugar into bowls of dough. Mainstream historical accounts suggest that early settlers had to be judicious with such ingredients, often rationing them for weeks at a time. Historians still argue about the precise quantities commonly used, but you sense that this moderation became part of the ritual of baking itself, a slow and deliberate balancing act. You watch as a young woman gently sprinkles salt over a mound of dough, pausing to fold it in with tender, patient motions. Fringe tidbits from diaries indicate that some settlers believed salt could temper the spirit of the dough, a poetic expression for controlling rise and texture. You smile at the thought, imagining these subtle interpretations guiding their daily practices. Your hands mimic her folding, enjoying the soothing repetition, the tactile engagement grounding your senses. Nearby, a small iron pot rests over coals, filled with a mixture of flour, water, and small scraps of dried herbs. You observe how heat interacts differently with this mixture compared to clay pots or pit ovens. Fringe observers claim that some settlers preferred iron for its predictability, while clay allowed a gentle, uneven heat that created softer interiors. You adjust the pot slightly, experimenting with ember placement, and notice how even subtle changes affect rising and browning. Joke 1. Settlers often relied on visual cues to gauge doneness. The golden hue, small bubbles forming along the crust, or a slight crackle when tapped. You practice this yourself, lightly pressing the top of a loaf, feeling its gentle resilience. Historians still debate whether such informal sensory techniques were universally effective, but in practice, they seem to have sufficed for feeding families and small communities. You glance at a child helping by gently kneading a small mound of dough. The tactile repetition, the press, fold, stretch, has an almost hypnotic effect. Fringe accounts suggest that some children hummed quietly while working, a soothing accompaniment that likely eased both dough and baker. You hum along softly, feeling a comforting rhythm settle through your own shoulders. Joke 2. Across the table, a man gently folds raisins and tiny scraps of preserved fruit into his dough. The act is deliberate and slow, the fruit punctuating the otherwise soft texture with chewy sweetness. Settlers learned that evenly distributing the fruit prevented dense pockets and ensured consistent cooking. You fold a small portion of dough yourself, noting how tactile awareness, combined with patience, becomes a quiet form of mastery. The faint aroma of baking bread blends with the earthy scent of evening, dry grass, and soft smoke from embers. Settlers were attentive to these subtle environmental cues. Moisture in the air could affect dough texture, wind direction influenced heat, and even the position of tables relative to the fire made a difference. You adjust your dough slightly, feeling satisfaction in small, careful interventions. A loaf emerges from the iron pot, golden and slightly fragrant from subtle additions of herbs and fruit. You inhale, letting the scent settle over you, and notice how the gentle care of the settlers transforms otherwise humble ingredients into something quietly nourishing. Fringe sources note that some bakers took pride in leaving slight imperfections, subtle marks of personality that humanized the process. Settlers often shared small pieces of fresh bread immediately, savoring the warmth, aroma, and softness. You break off a tiny piece and feel the comforting texture between your fingers and lips, a reminder that even simple practices can bring profound satisfaction. Historians still debate the prevalence of these shared rituals, but the quiet joy in this moment is unmistakable. As night deepens, the settlement feels cocooned in warmth, scent, and gentle activity. The combination of careful kneading, subtle improvisation, and patient observation creates more than bread. It creates a rhythm, a quiet, soothing cadence to close the day. You lean back, inhaling deeply, letting the ambient sounds and aromas lull your thoughts into calm. The night air grows cooler, carrying a soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of a possum, and you trudge toward a small clearing where settlers have begun preparing a modest batch of puddings. Mainstream historical accounts note that early Australian settlers often combined flour with whatever liquids were available: water, diluted milk, or occasionally leftover whey from cheese making to create soft, warm puddings. Historians still argue whether puddings were considered a dessert or a form of sustenance, but watching the careful hands at work, you sense that their purpose was as much about comfort as nutrition. You kneel beside a low wooden table where a woman gently mixes flour with water, adding tiny pinches of native herbs. Fringe tidbits suggest that settlers occasionally used ground acacia seeds for texture and flavor, lending a subtle earthiness to their puddings. You fold the mixture slowly, noticing the transformation from powdery mess to soft, cohesive dough. Joke 1. The rhythmic press, fold, and swirl feels soothing, almost meditative, drawing your attention to the tactile satisfaction of each movement. Nearby, a child pours a small cup of diluted milk into another bowl of flour. Settlers often involve children in these minor baking chores, teaching patience, observation, and the subtle art of tactile intuition. Fringe anecdotes suggest that children sometimes left tiny impressions in the dough, a playful signature, which may have been a form of quiet pride. You smile as you replicate the motion, the smooth texture warming your hands. You notice how the settlers adjust their technique depending on ambient conditions, the humidity in the air, the temperature of embers, and even slight shifts in wind direction influenced how puddings and bread would rise and cook. Historians still debate whether such environmental sensitivity was taught deliberately or learned purely through trial and error, but the meticulous care on display leaves little doubt about its importance. A small iron pot holds a portion of pudding, its surface slowly firming over gentle coals. Fringe sources suggest that settlers would occasionally cover the tops with leaves to retain moisture, a subtle trick that softened the crust and created a tender interior. You watch the steam rise, carrying the faint scent of warmed herbs and flour, a sensory reminder that small improvisations make a noticeable difference in outcome. Across the table, another baker carefully stirs in tiny fragments of preserved fruit. The soft rustle and occasional plop as raisins fold into the dough create a calming auditory rhythm. Settlers relied on subtle cues like these to judge the consistency of their mixtures, honing an intuitive feel for texture and moisture. Joke 2. You fold your own portion gently, mimicking the same careful movements, feeling satisfaction in the deliberate pace. You step back to watch multiple pots over embers, noting the variations in cooking methods. Some simmer slowly in clay, others bake with a light ember covering. Each technique yields slightly different textures and aromas. Fringe accounts indicate that some settlers believed clay imparted a gentler warmth, while iron promoted even cooking. Historians still argue over which method was preferred, but the aroma drifting across the clearing suggests that either approach was comforting in its own right. The night continues its quiet progression, the soft ambient sounds merging with the subtle creaks of tables and hushed conversation. You press lightly into a pudding, feeling its delicate give, the texture promising soft, gentle comfort. Settlers often use these small tactile assessments as informal quality checks, a sensory meditation of sorts, bridging practicality and intuition. You carefully lift a pot from the embers, the steam rising in lazy curls. The pudding feels soft and warm to the touch, flecked with tiny herbs and small bits of preserved fruit. Fringe sources suggest that some settlers would sprinkle a pinch of extra wattle seed on top for subtle flavor and texture contrast. You do the same, enjoying the small, satisfying addition. As the night deepens, the settlement is wrapped in warmth, quiet labor, and subtle scents. The careful folding, mixing, and monitoring of puddings exemplifies the gentle improvisation and patient observation that characterize early baking practices. Historians still debate specific techniques and recipes, but the comfort, quiet rhythm, and tactile satisfaction of these processes are undeniable, offering a slow, soothing cadence to close the day. The stars begin to punctuate the darkening sky, and you notice the soft glow of embers flickering across the settlement. You trudge toward a low table where settlers have begun experimenting with slightly more complex bread mixtures, incorporating combinations of flour, water, and small foraged seeds. Mainstream historical accounts note that early settlers often scavenged local seeds and grains, grinding them into coarse flour to supplement imported varieties. Historians still debate whether these seeds were valued more for nutrition or novelty, but the soft crunch they lend to the bread creates a subtle satisfaction that transcends mere practicality. You kneel beside a woman gently pressing a handful of ground seeds into dough. Fringe tidbits from diaries suggest that settlers occasionally used the seeds of wattles, banksias, and other native plants not only for taste, but as an emergency source of protein during lean periods. You fold the seeds into the dough carefully, feeling the small resistance as they mingle with the soft flour and water. Joke 1. The slow, repetitive motion is meditative, almost like a massage for your hands and mind alike. Nearby, a child sprinkles a tiny pinch of salt over another batch, the crystals glinting faintly in the ember light. Settlers often involve children in these tasks, blending instruction with gentle responsibility. Fringe anecdotes suggest that children sometimes hummed softly as they worked, a calming rhythm that seemed to affect both dough and baker, creating a soothing environment. You mimic the humming quietly, letting it blend with the subtle sounds of the night. You observe how settlers carefully adjust heat and placement. Clay pots, iron pans, and low-lying embers each interacted differently with the dough, requiring attentive observation. Historians still argue about the precision and universality of these adjustments, but watching the gentle attention to detail is mesmerizing. You slide a seeded loaf into a clay pot, rotating it slightly to capture the perfect balance of heat, noting the way steam curls lazily upward. Across the clearing, another baker works with a small bowl of flour and wattle seed, experimenting with ratios. Fringe sources suggest that some settlers believed altering proportions could affect not only texture but mood, a curious, almost poetic reflection of their day-to-day life. You gently replicate the movements, folding and pressing, feeling the calming repetition settle through your shoulders and arms. The scent of warm bread, toasted seeds, and faint smoke fills the air, mingling with the soft night breeze carrying eucalyptus. Settlers became remarkably attuned to such environmental subtleties, understanding how humidity, wind, and residual heat influenced both texture and rise. You adjust a nearby pot slightly, testing the ambient warmth, and feel a meditative satisfaction in this gentle negotiation with the natural world. A loaf emerges golden brown, flecked with tiny seeds, subtle in aroma yet rich in texture. You run your fingers along its surface, feeling the gentle crust give way to a tender interior. Settlers often marveled at these small successes, quietly sharing pieces among neighbors or family. Historians still debate how ritualized this sharing was, but the act itself is undeniably comforting. You notice a small puddle of water left on the table, evaporating slowly in the warmth of embers. Fringe observations suggest that some bakers would sprinkle a few drops of water over loaves during baking to encourage a softer crust, a minor improvisation with a noticeable effect. You experiment gently, watching as the steam rises in lazy curls, softening the dough's surface. Joke 2. The night continues to envelop the settlement in quiet rhythm. Hands fold, press, and knead. Pots simmer softly, coals crackle and hiss. The subtle improvisations, attentiveness to ambient conditions, and gentle, patient experimentation combine to create more than sustenance. You lean back slightly, inhaling the mingling scents of seeds, dough, and herbs, and feel a deep, calming satisfaction in the slow, methodical practice that surrounds you. By this point, the combination of repetitive tasks, ambient warmth, and soft aromas has created a gentle lull, a rhythm almost designed to ease mind and body. Settlers' quiet attentiveness and small innovations offer a comforting, soothing cadence that resonates far beyond the loaves themselves. The night air grows cooler, carrying the faint whisper of eucalyptus through the settlement, and you trudge toward a table where settlers are shaping small, individual rolls. Mainstream historical sources note that early Australian settlers often made miniature loaves and rolls to conserve flour, feed children, or allow for easier storage. Historians still debate whether these small portions were primarily practical or also a subtle indulgence, but the sight of tiny, meticulously formed rolls resting on cloth conveys a sense of care and quiet pride. You kneel beside a young woman pressing a handful of dough into a neat, rounded shape. Fringe anecdotes from diaries suggest that settlers sometimes imprinted simple patterns, tiny lines, or crosshatches into rolls, either for identification or as a playful decoration. You mimic the gentle scoring, feeling the dough's pliability shift beneath your fingers, and notice a small, soothing satisfaction in this delicate act. Joke 1. The repetition of press, fold, and shape is meditative, grounding you in the quiet rhythms of settlement life. Nearby, a child carefully sprinkles tiny flecks of seeds atop each roll. Settlers often engage children in this process, teaching attention to detail and an appreciation for subtle aesthetics. Fringe sources claim that children sometimes competed quietly to see whose rolls looked most even or held together best, infusing a gentle sense of playful competition into routine tasks. You fold your own portion, enjoying the tactile engagement and slow, deliberate rhythm. You notice how ambient conditions influence the dough. A gentle breeze through nearby trees slightly cools the surface, affecting stickiness, while residual heat from nearby embers encourages a soft rise. Historians still debate the extent to which settlers adjusted their techniques based on such subtleties, but your hands instinctively compensate, folding and pressing in response to tactile cues. Across the clearing, a woman carefully places rolls into a low clay oven, adjusting coals to maintain a steady, even temperature. Fringe accounts suggest that the small leaf-covered loaves were often rotated gently to ensure uniform baking, a minor improvisation that subtly enhanced texture. You watch the process, appreciating the deliberate patience involved and the gentle attention to sensory details, the warmth, the aroma, the faint crackle of coals. The scent of freshly baked dough mingles with the faintly nutty aroma of seeds and the soft smokiness from embers. Settlers were remarkably attuned to these olfactory cues, using them to gauge doneness and adjust timing. You lightly press a roll's surface, feeling its tender resistance, and noting how small interventions like a careful turn or slight ember adjustment can subtly improve the result. Nearby, a small iron pot holds a mixture of flour and foraged herbs, simmering gently over coals. Fringe observations indicate that some settlers would lightly brush herbal oils on rolls before baking to enhance aroma and create a subtle sheen. You fold a small portion of herb-infused dough into your batch, noting the tactile difference and inhaling the soft, calming fragrance. Joke 2. You pause, letting the ambient sounds, the crackle of embers, rustling leaves, and soft murmurs wash over you. The act of shaping, seasoning, and baking rolls combines patient attention, tactile satisfaction, and gentle improvisation. Historians still argue about which herbs and seeds were most commonly used, but the soothing pattern of repetition and subtle aroma remains undeniable. By the time the rolls emerge golden brown and delicately speckled with seeds, the settlement is cloaked in a gentle warmth and quiet camaraderie. These small, thoughtful creations, shaped with care and attended to patiently, illustrate how settlers transformed simple ingredients into comforting, meditative rituals that nourished both body and spirit. As you step back, the rhythm of folding, pressing, and baking continues around you, creating a gentle lull that seems designed to ease thoughts and relax the mind. The quiet intimacy of these routines embodies the understated charm of early settler life, leaving you with a sense of cozy satisfaction. A cool breeze drifts through the settlement, rustling the leaves of nearby trees, and you move toward a small table where settlers are experimenting with combining bread dough with mashed root vegetables. Mainstream historical records note that early Australian settlers often incorporated whatever foraged or cultivated vegetables were available, such as yams, sweet potatoes, or native tubers to enrich their bread. Historians still debate whether these mixtures were widely consumed or limited to experimental batches, but the resulting earthy aroma promises both subtle sweetness and comfort. You kneel beside a woman mashing a small tuber into a smooth paste, the soft, slightly moist texture pressing easily between your fingers. Fringe anecdotes suggest that settlers occasionally added a tiny pinch of wattle seed to these vegetable-infused doughs to enhance flavor and texture. You fold the paste into the dough carefully, noticing the dough's color shift from pale beige to a warm, gentle ochre, and inhale the soft, warming scent. Joke 1. The slow, rhythmic mixing is almost hypnotic, grounding you in the tactile pleasure of transforming raw ingredients into nourishing bread. Nearby, a child carefully sprinkles small fragments of dried herbs into another batch, giggling softly as a few pieces scatter across the table. Settlers often encourage children to participate in such tasks, teaching patience, sensory awareness, and the satisfaction of contributing to daily life. Fringe sources suggest that some children improvise tiny patterns on dough surfaces, adding subtle, playful signatures. You mimic the gentle sprinkling, feeling a quiet connection to this small, whimsical tradition. You notice how ambient conditions subtly affect the dough's consistency. The evening's cool air draws out moisture more quickly, requiring slightly longer kneading and occasional adjustment of water content. Historians still debate whether settlers consciously accounted for such environmental factors or adapted instinctively through observation, but you feel an almost meditative connection to the process, intuitively responding to touch and feel. Across the clearing, a woman slides a tray of vegetable-infused loaves into a clay oven, carefully adjusting embers for even heat distribution. Fringe observations indicate that covering loaves with leaves or cloth helped maintain moisture, particularly with the addition of vegetables that could otherwise dry out during baking. You watch the gentle transformation as steam rises lazily, the dough softening and warming the air around you. The aroma of earthy tubers, soft bread, and faintly roasted herbs drifts across the settlement, mingling with the cool night air and distant calls of nocturnal wildlife. Settlers developed a subtle attunement to these sensory cues, using smell, feel, and visual signs to judge readiness. You gently press the dough, noticing its elasticity and resilience, a soothing, tactile affirmation of patient care and observation. Nearby, another baker shapes small, leaf-flecked rolls from vegetable dough, pressing lightly and rotating them with careful attention. Fringe sources suggest that some settlers whispered softly to their loaves, a quiet gesture perhaps meant to infuse comfort or patience into the bread, a small, poetic touch. Joke 2. You fold and shape your own pieces, feeling the calming rhythm of the repeated, deliberate motions. By the time the loaves emerge from the oven, golden with soft ochre hues and subtle herb flecks, the settlement is bathed in a gentle warmth and quiet satisfaction. The careful combination of foraged vegetables, gentle seasoning, and attentive heat management produces bread that is comforting, nurturing, and quietly satisfying. Historians still debate the prevalence of these recipes, but the sensory experience, the touch, smell, and sight leaves no question as to their cozy charm. As night deepens, you lean back slightly, inhaling the mingling aromas of root vegetables, herbs, and baking dough. The gentle patience of kneading, folding, and monitoring creates a quiet rhythm, a slow, soothing cadence that seems designed to ease both mind and body. Settlers' inventive use of vegetables and attentive practices illustrate how even humble ingredients can offer moments of calm, satisfaction, and understated delight. The night has settled into a serene rhythm, punctuated by the soft crackle of embers and the occasional rustle of leaves, and you trudge toward a low table where settlers are experimenting with incorporating early dairy products into their bread. Mainstream historical accounts indicate that settlers often used leftover whey, milk, or cream to enrich dough, lending subtle creaminess and improving texture. Historians still debate how consistently these dairy enrichments were used, but the gentle, comforting aroma rising from the dough suggests they were treasured when available. You kneel beside a woman carefully stirring a small bowl of flour into a mixture of water and leftover whey, watching the dough slowly coalesce into a smooth, pliable mass. Fringe anecdotes note that some settlers added small amounts of cream or curd for flavor and moisture, often reserved for special occasions or family gatherings. You fold the enriched mixture, noticing how the dough's surface becomes glossier and slightly more elastic, a tactile reward for your gentle, patient movements. Joke 1. The slow, repetitive motion is soothing, almost like a massage for both hands and mind. Nearby, a child sprinkles a pinch of sugar into another batch of dough, the crystals glinting softly in the ember light. Settlers often involve children in these subtle tasks, teaching patience and an appreciation for texture, smell, and small visual cues. Fringe sources suggest that children sometimes hummed softly while kneading, a quiet rhythm that likely encouraged both dough and baker to remain calm. You hum along gently, blending into the ambient sounds of the evening. You observe how the settlers adjust techniques according to environmental cues. Clay pots, iron pans, and open coals each imparted subtle differences in texture and heat distribution. Historians still argue about how universally settlers accounted for these variations, but the careful attention to placement and gentle monitoring shows a tactile mastery born of both observation and intuition. You slide a small dairy-enriched loaf into a clay oven, rotating it slightly to capture even heat. Across the clearing, another baker works with a small batch of dough mixed with soft cheese curds. Fringe sources suggest that settlers occasionally used this method to create a tender, slightly tangy loaf that complemented their other foods. You fold your own dough carefully, feeling the satisfying resistance and smoothness, a tactile meditation in miniature. The scent of warm bread, faintly sweetened by sugar and enriched by dairy, mingles with the subtle smokiness of embers. Settlers relied on such sensory cues, smell, touch, and visual appearance to assess readiness. You press lightly into a loaf, noting the gentle spring back and the soft warmth beneath your fingers, a quiet reassurance of success. Nearby, small rolls are carefully shaped and brushed with diluted whey to maintain moisture during baking. Fringe observations suggest that some settlers whispered small encouragements to their dough, a poetic touch meant to lend patience or care to the baking process. Joke 2. You mimic the careful brushing, inhaling the comforting aroma and feeling your own movements settle into a slow rhythm. By the time the dairy-enriched loaves emerge, golden and gently puffed with soft sheen, the settlement is bathed in warmth, aroma, and quiet satisfaction. The settlers' attention to small details, patient folding, and gentle improvisation transform humble ingredients into comforting, meditative creations. Historians still debate specifics, but the sensory and emotional impact is undeniable. As night deepens, you step back slightly, absorbing the ambient warmth, subtle aromas, and quiet human rhythm. The careful kneading, folding, and monitoring of dairy-enriched dough exemplifies how patience, observation, and gentle improvisation can create both sustenance and soothing meditation for body and mind. The night deepens, and a gentle hush settles over the settlement, broken only by the faint crackle of embers and the occasional rustle of leaves. You trudge toward a small, rough-hewn table where settlers are experimenting with infusing their dough with early fruits and preserves. Mainstream historical accounts indicate that settlers occasionally incorporated dried fruits like raisins, figs, or locally foraged berries to sweeten bread and rolls, providing occasional bursts of flavor amid otherwise plain staples. Historians still debate whether such sweetened bread was reserved for children, special occasions, or simply whenever fruit was plentiful, but the soft, inviting aroma floating through the night air suggests a subtle, quiet indulgence. You kneel beside a woman carefully folding tiny fragments of dried berries into her dough. Fringe anecdotes reveal that some settlers soaked fruits in water or diluted wine before adding them, softening their texture and releasing gentle sweetness into the mixture. You press and fold the dough with slow, rhythmic movements, feeling the small resistance of plumpened berries and noticing the gradual change in color and texture. Joke 1. The repetition of folding, pressing, and turning is quietly hypnotic, a soothing cadence for your hands and mind. Nearby, a child sprinkles a tiny pinch of sugar over another batch, the crystals glinting faintly in the dim ember light. Settlers often involve children in these subtle, hands-on tasks, teaching patience, tactile awareness, and a sense of contribution to communal efforts. Fringe sources suggest that children sometimes hummed or whispered to their dough, creating a gentle auditory rhythm that eased both their own attention and the dough's transformation. You hum quietly along, feeling the calm rhythm permeate your shoulders and hands. You notice how ambient conditions affect the dough's consistency. The night air, slightly cooler and drier than earlier, draws moisture from the mixture, requiring careful adjustments, additional water, slower folding, or brief resting periods. Historians still debate whether settlers consciously measured these changes or adapted instinctively, but the gentle observation and small interventions demonstrate a quiet mastery of environment and craft. Across the clearing, another baker places a tray of fruit-studded rolls into a clay oven, rotating them slowly to ensure even baking. Fringe accounts suggest that covering loaves with leaves or cloth maintained moisture and subtly enhanced texture, especially when fruits could otherwise dry or caramelize unevenly. You watch the transformation, noting the soft steam rising from the pots and the gentle aroma that fills the cool night air. The scent of warm dough, lightly sweetened by berries and sugar, mingles with the earthy aroma of embers and faintly roasted herbs. Settlers were remarkably attuned to such sensory cues, using smell, touch, and visual signs to gauge readiness. You gently press a roll, noting its tender elasticity and warm surface, a tactile confirmation of careful patience and attention. Nearby, a woman brushes tiny droplets of water over the tops of rolls to encourage gentle browning and soft crusts. Fringe observations suggest that subtle additions like this were often improvised, yet profoundly effective, highlighting settlers' creative yet unhurried approach to baking. Joke 2. You mimic the careful brush, inhaling the soft, comforting aroma of dough and fruit. By the time fruit-studded loaves and rolls emerge golden brown with soft glints of berry, the settlement is bathed in warmth, gentle light, and quiet satisfaction. The process, careful folding, subtle improvisation, and patient monitoring transforms humble ingredients into comforting, meditative creations. Historians still debate specific recipes, but the soothing rhythm, aroma, and tactile engagement are undeniable. As night deepens further, you lean back slightly, absorbing the combined warmth, subtle scents, and quiet human rhythm. The gentle kneading, folding, and monitoring of fruit-enriched dough creates a calming cadence, an understated meditation for both body and mind. Settlers' inventive use of fruits and careful attention to detail exemplify the quiet beauty of early baking practices. A soft wind drifts through the settlement, carrying the subtle scent of ember smoke and distant eucalyptus. You trudge toward a low table where settlers are experimenting with incorporating native seeds and grains into their loaves, adding texture, flavor, and a sense of connection to the land. Mainstream historical accounts indicate that settlers sometimes mixed imported wheat flour with ground native grains like millet, wattle seeds, or kangaroo grass seed, creating bread with a slightly nutty, wholesome taste. Historians still debate the nutritional significance versus the experimental novelty of these grains, but the gentle crunch they impart offers a tactile delight alongside the aroma of baking bread. You kneel beside a woman folding a small batch of dough studded with tiny seeds. Fringe anecdotes note that some settlers believed adding these grains enhanced not only taste but fortitude, a poetic reflection of daily life and survival. You gently press and fold the dough, noting the subtle resistance and the way the grains shift and integrate into the soft mass. Joke 1. The repetitive motion, the press, fold, stretch, is quietly hypnotic, coaxing your mind into a calm rhythm. Nearby, a child carefully sprinkles additional seeds atop another batch, arranging them evenly with deliberate care. Settlers often involve children in these tasks, teaching patience, dexterity, and an appreciation for tactile subtleties. Fringe sources suggest that children sometimes imagine tiny stories about their loaves, pretending the seeds were tiny travelers on a journey, which added a whimsical, playful rhythm to the chore. You mimic the gentle arrangement, enjoying the meditative repetition. You notice how ambient conditions influence the dough's behavior. The evening's cooler, drier air draws moisture from the mixture, demanding careful folding, occasional misting, or brief resting periods to maintain pliability. Historians still debate whether settlers consciously calibrated for these factors or adjusted instinctively, but the intuitive attention to texture and temperature is unmistakable. Across the clearing, a baker gently rotates seed-studded loaves in a low clay oven, adjusting embers to maintain even heat. Fringe observations suggest that covering the loaves with leaves not only retained moisture, but subtly infused the bread with aromatic hints of eucalyptus or wattle. You watch the slow transformation, noting the gentle rise, soft steam, and faint nutty fragrance, and feel a calming sense of connection to both ingredients and environment. The aroma of warm bread, faintly nutty from seeds and grains, mingles with the soft smokiness of embers. Settlers relied on sensory cues, smell, touch, and visual inspection to assess readiness, cultivating a quiet attentiveness that blends practicality with gentle mindfulness. You press lightly into a loaf, feeling its tender elasticity, the subtle warmth radiating through your hands, a quiet confirmation of patience and care. Nearby, a woman brushes a few drops of water over the dough to encourage a tender crust, a small improvisation often overlooked in historical accounts. Fringe anecdotes suggest that settlers sometimes whispered softly to their loaves, a poetic, calming ritual meant to imbue patience and care. Joke 2. You gently replicate the motion, inhaling the comforting fragrance and feeling the repetitive rhythm. Settle your thoughts. By the time the seed-studded loaves emerge, golden brown and flecked with tiny grains, the settlement is wrapped in warmth, aroma, and quiet satisfaction. The deliberate folding, attentive observation, and subtle improvisations demonstrate how settlers transformed simple ingredients into comforting, meditative creations. Historians still debate specific recipes and techniques, but the sensory and emotional experience is undeniably soothing. As night continues its quiet sweep, you step back, absorbing the combined warmth, aroma, and human rhythm. The gentle kneading, folding, and baking of grain and seed-enriched bread creates a meditative cadence, quietly settling both body and mind. Settlers' careful experimentation and sensitivity to ingredients exemplify the understated charm of early baking rituals. The night deepens further, and the air cools to a soft, gentle crispness, carrying with it the distant calls of nocturnal wildlife. You trudge toward a clearing where settlers are testing subtle variations in hydration and fermentation, aiming for slightly lighter, more tender loaves. Mainstream historical sources indicate that early settlers sometimes allowed dough to rest longer, experimenting with natural fermentation, often aided by leftover whey, beer dregs, or even a small bit of sourdough starter. Historians still debate how common such practices were, but the slow, deliberate transformation of dough over time offers a subtle, almost meditative visual rhythm. You kneel beside a woman gently folding dough that has rested for hours, feeling how the structure has changed soft, slightly airy, and more pliable. Fringe anecdotes suggest that some settlers believed whispering softly or tapping lightly on the dough encouraged better rise, a whimsical ritual whose psychological comfort may have been as valuable as any scientific effect. You mimic the gentle folds, noticing the tactile feedback of elasticity and softness, and inhale the faint, slightly tangy aroma. Joke 1. The repeated motions of folding and pressing encourage a calm, almost hypnotic rhythm. Nearby, a child sprinkles a pinch of flour atop another rested batch, carefully dusting to prevent stickiness while shaping small rolls. Settlers frequently involve children in these tasks, imparting patience and a sense of contribution to daily life. Fringe sources claim that children often treated the dough as a canvas, imprinting tiny patterns or playful designs before baking, adding an element of quiet creativity. You mimic these movements, enjoying the soothing repetition and tactile satisfaction. You notice how the ambient temperature and residual heat subtly affect the dough's elasticity and moisture retention. Cool night air slows fermentation, while proximity to embers encourages gentle expansion. Historians still debate whether settlers monitored these factors intentionally or adapted instinctively. But your hands adjust in response to feel, gradually shaping dough to a tender, balanced texture. Across the clearing, a woman carefully places trays of rested dough into clay ovens, rotating them for even heat and occasionally misting surfaces to maintain moisture. Fringe observations suggest that these small improvisations, adjusting heat, steam, or placement, produced nuanced differences in texture and crust, demonstrating settlers' sensitivity to environmental cues. You watch the gentle transformation, noticing faint steam rising, softening crust, and aroma subtly shifting from raw flour to a comforting warmth. The scent of soft, slowly fermented dough, mingled with faint smoke and subtle warmth, fills the settlement. Settlers relied on smell, touch, and sight to judge readiness, cultivating a quiet attentiveness that blends practicality with meditative presence. You press lightly into a loaf, feeling its gentle spring and elasticity, a tactile reassurance of careful, patient work. Nearby, small rolls are brushed with tiny droplets of water or whey before baking to ensure tender, soft surfaces. Fringe anecdotes suggest settlers sometimes murmured softly to the dough as part of a calming ritual, an understated act of care and intention. Joke 2. You gently replicate the motion, inhaling the subtle aroma and letting the rhythm of repeated actions ease your mind. By the time the rested and lightly fermented loaves emerge golden brown, slightly puffed, and subtly aromatic, the settlement is wrapped in warmth, quiet satisfaction, and gentle focus. The careful folding, patient observation, and minor improvisations transform humble dough into comforting, meditative bread. Historians still debate precise methods, but the sensory and emotional effect is undeniable. As night deepens and shadows lengthen, you lean back slightly, breathing in the combined warmth, aroma, and quiet rhythm. The gentle kneading, folding, and monitoring of fermented dough embodies a meditative cadence, settling both mind and body. Settlers' patient attentiveness and subtle experimentation highlight the understated beauty of early baking routines. A soft murmur of wind passes through the settlement, carrying the faint aroma of embers, eucalyptus, and the lingering scent of baking bread. You trudge toward a table where settlers are experimenting with layering flavors, folding in small quantities of herbs, dried flowers, or native spices to enrich otherwise simple loaves. Mainstream historical records suggest that settlers occasionally added such botanicals for subtle aroma and taste, blending both imported and local varieties. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was, but the gentle fragrance drifting through the night hints at both care and quiet experimentation. You kneel beside a woman carefully folding dried chamomile and wattle seeds into her dough, watching as the tiny flecks scatter through the soft mass. Fringe anecdotes suggest that some settlers believed adding these gentle botanicals encouraged calm, not just in flavor, but in mood, an early poetic mindfulness. You fold the dough slowly, feeling its elasticity shift beneath your hands, and inhale the soft, calming fragrance. Joke 1. The repeated motion of folding, pressing, and rotating is quietly hypnotic, grounding your attention in the moment. Nearby, a child carefully sprinkles tiny lavender blossoms atop a small roll, arranging them with deliberate care. Settlers often involved children in these small, sensory tasks, teaching both patience and attentiveness to texture and aroma. Fringe sources suggest that children sometimes imagine the dough as tiny gardens, adding subtle patterns or playful flourishes, enhancing the tactile and visual enjoyment of baking. You imitate the delicate sprinkling, letting the rhythm calm your shoulders and mind. You notice how ambient factors subtly affect the dough's performance. Cooler evening air slows hydration and rise, while proximity to embers encourages gentle expansion and subtle aroma release. Historians still debate whether settlers consciously adjusted for these cues or adapted instinctively, but your hands respond intuitively, kneading and folding to maintain optimal texture. Across the clearing, another baker gently rotates herb and flour-infused loaves in a clay oven, occasionally brushing lightly with water to encourage tender crust. Fringe observations suggest that some settlers whispered or hummed quietly as they worked, a meditative ritual believed to enhance patience and care. You mirror the motions, inhaling the gentle aroma and allowing the tactile rhythm to soothe your mind. The scent of soft bread, flecked with herbs and flowers, mingles with the smoke and subtle warmth of embers. Settlers relied on visual cues, touch, and smell to gauge readiness, cultivating quiet attentiveness that blends practical skill with meditative awareness. You press lightly into a loaf, feeling its gentle spring, soft warmth, and subtle texture, a tactile affirmation of careful patience. Nearby, small rolls are decorated with additional seeds or petals before baking, minor improvisations that add visual charm and aromatic nuance. Fringe anecdotes suggest that these small gestures provided comfort and satisfaction beyond taste alone. Joke 2. You carefully replicate these gestures, enjoying the calming rhythm of folding, brushing, and arranging. By the time the herb and flour-infused loaves emerge golden brown, aromatic, and gently puffed, the settlement is wrapped in warmth, fragrance, and quiet satisfaction. The attentive folding, subtle improvisation, and sensory mindfulness transform humble dough into soothing, meditative creations. Historians still debate exact methods, but the emotional and sensory impact is undeniable. As night deepens, you step back, absorbing warmth, aroma, and gentle human rhythm. The deliberate folding, kneading, and subtle infusion of herbs and flowers creates a calming cadence, an understated meditation for both body and mind. Settlers' patient creativity and sensitivity to ingredients illustrate the quiet charm of early baking practices. A gentle hush blankets the settlement, broken only by the distant calls of nocturnal birds and the soft crackle of embers. You trudge toward a low table where settlers are experimenting with texture variations, incorporating coarse and finely milled flours to create subtle differences in crumb and chewiness. Mainstream historical accounts indicate that settlers sometimes blended coarse whole grain flour with refined wheat, producing bread that was both hearty and tender. Historians still debate how standardized these mixtures were, but the tactile contrast in kneading and the subtle aroma of mixed grains offer a soothing sensory experience. You kneel beside a woman gently folding a mixture of coarse and fine flour into a soft, pliable dough, observing the slight resistance from coarser particles. Fringe anecdotes suggest that some settlers experimented with tiny amounts of roasted grains, crushed seeds, or lightly toasted flour to enhance flavor and texture, a quiet innovation born of curiosity. You fold and press the dough slowly, feeling its elasticity change under your hands and inhaling the warm, slightly nutty scent. Joke 1. The repetitive motion of folding and pressing is hypnotic, grounding your attention in the present. Nearby, a child carefully sifts a small handful of coarse flour onto a batch, dusting lightly to prevent sticking while shaping small rolls. Settlers often involve children in these subtle sensory tasks, teaching patience, tactile awareness, and gentle observational skills. Fringe sources suggest that children sometimes imagine the grains as tiny hills or mountains within their dough, adding an element of playful creativity to routine tasks. You imitate the careful dusting and shaping, enjoying the calming repetition. You notice how ambient conditions influence dough behavior. Slightly cooler night air draws moisture, while residual heat from embers encourages gentle expansion. Historians still debate whether settlers consciously adjusted for such variables or adapted instinctively, but your hands respond intuitively, maintaining pliability through careful folding and pressing. Across the clearing, another baker gently rotates a tray of coarse and fine flour loaves in a clay oven, adjusting embers to maintain even heat. Fringe observations suggest covering loaves with leaves or cloth preserved moisture and subtly enhanced texture. You watch as gentle steam rises, softening the crust, while the aroma shifts from raw flour to warm, comforting bread. The scent of mixed grains, faintly nutty and slightly sweet, mingles with the soft smokiness of embers. Settlers relied on tactile, visual, and olfactory cues to assess readiness, cultivating quiet attentiveness that blends practical skill with meditation. You press lightly into a loaf, feeling gentle spring, soft warmth, and subtle texture, a tactile affirmation of careful patience. Nearby, small rolls are brushed with a tiny touch of water to encourage tender crusts, a minor improvisation with noticeable effect. Fringe anecdotes suggest settlers sometimes whispered softly to their dough, creating a soothing ritual of care and patience. Joke 2. You gently replicate the motion, inhaling the comforting aroma and allowing the repetitive rhythm to ease your mind. By the time coarse and fine flour loaves emerge golden brown and gently puffed, the settlement is bathed in warmth, aroma, and quiet satisfaction. The deliberate folding, attentive observation, and subtle improvisation demonstrate how simple flour variations transform humble dough into meditative creations. Historians still debate precise methods, but the sensory and emotional impact is undeniable. As night deepens, you lean back slightly, absorbing the warmth, aroma, and gentle rhythm of human activity. The careful kneading, folding, and monitoring of mixed flour dough creates a meditative cadence, quietly settling body and mind. Settlers' patient attentiveness and experimentation illustrate the understated beauty of early baking rituals. A soft, almost imperceptible chill drifts through the settlement, mingling with the lingering warmth of embers and the faint aroma of baked loaves. You trudge toward a low table where settlers are experimenting with gentle sweeteners, incorporating small amounts of honey, treacle, or native syrups into their bread dough. Mainstream historical accounts indicate that early Australian settlers occasionally used these natural sweeteners to enrich flavor and retain moisture. Historians still debate how consistently such sweetened breads were produced, but the subtle aroma of caramelized sweetness wafting through the night suggests a quiet delight and patient experimentation. You kneel beside a woman carefully folding golden droplets of honey into her dough, watching the sticky liquid absorb gradually, softening and enriching the texture. Fringe anecdotes suggest that some settlers believed adding honey or syrup not only enhanced flavor but provided a gentle, soothing effect, a comforting thought during long, quiet evenings. You fold the dough slowly, feeling its elasticity shift beneath your hands, and inhale the soft, sweet scent rising lazily. Joke 1. The repetitive motions, the press, fold, stretch, create a gentle hypnotic rhythm, grounding your attention and slowing your thoughts. Nearby, A child drizzles a tiny bit of syrup over a small roll, brushing it lightly across the surface to ensure even coating. Settlers often involve children in these tasks, teaching patience and an appreciation for texture, smell, and the visual allure of subtle glazes. Fringe sources suggest that children sometimes imagine the syrup as golden rivers flowing through miniature landscapes on their dough, blending tactile activity with playful creativity. You mimic the careful brushing, letting the rhythm soothe your hands and mind. You notice how ambient factors influence the sweetened dough. Cooler night air slows hydration and expansion, while warmth from nearby embers encourages gentle fermentation and aromatic release. Historians still debate whether settlers consciously adjusted for these subtleties or adapted instinctively, but your hands intuitively respond to touch, folding, and pressing to maintain softness and pliability. Across the clearing, another baker rotates trays of honey, or syrup-enriched loaves in a clay oven, occasionally brushing them to encourage tender crusts and caramelized tops. Fringe observations suggest that settlers sometimes added a few crushed seeds or herbs atop sweetened dough, subtly enhancing both aroma and texture. You watch as faint steam rises, softening crusts and releasing a comforting, gentle sweetness that drifts into the cool night air. The scent of warm, sweetened bread mingles with smoke and earth, filling the settlement with quiet contentment. Settlers relied on touch, smell, and visual cues to judge readiness, cultivating an understated attentiveness that blends practical skill with meditative presence. You press lightly into a loaf, feeling gentle spring, warmth, and the slight stickiness of syrup, a tactile affirmation of patience and care. Nearby, small rolls are brushed with a light glaze before baking, minor improvisations that elevate texture and aroma. Fringe anecdotes suggest settlers sometimes whispered quietly to their dough as a calming ritual, adding poetic intention to the process. Joke 2. You gently replicate the motion, inhaling the soft, sweet aroma and letting the repetitive rhythm ease your thoughts. By the time sweetened loaves emerge golden brown, glossy, and softly puffed, the settlement is enveloped in warmth, aroma, and quiet satisfaction. The careful folding, attentive observation, and subtle improvisation of sweetened dough illustrate how simple ingredients transform humble bread into a meditative, comforting experience. Historians still debate exact methods, but the sensory and emotional effect is unmistakable. As night continues, you step back, absorbing warmth, aroma, and gentle human rhythm. The deliberate kneading, folding, and subtle sweetening create a soothing cadence, quietly settling both body and mind. Settlers' patience, creativity, and sensitivity to ingredients highlight the understated charm of early baking practices. A quiet hush has settled over the settlement, interrupted only by the soft rustle of leaves and the faint crackle of embers. You trudge toward a table where settlers are experimenting with layering textures, combining dense and airy doughs to produce subtly varied crumb structures. Mainstream historical records indicate that some settlers occasionally mixed pre-baked or partially fermented dough into fresh batches, creating a lighter loaf while conserving ingredients. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was, but the gentle rise and soft aroma suggest both practicality and a meditative rhythm in the baking process. You kneel beside a woman, gently folding portions of older dough into fresh flour mixtures, feeling the contrasting textures merge beneath your fingers. Fringe anecdotes suggest that some settlers believed that the inclusion of older dough added character and wisdom to the loaf, a poetic reflection of continuity and care. You fold and press the dough slowly, noting how the texture softens and develops subtle elasticity. Joke 1. The repeated folding and pressing motions act like a gentle lullaby for your hands, coaxing your mind into a calm, rhythmic state. Nearby, a child sprinkles a few seeds over the surface of an airy loaf, adding a tactile layer that enhances both appearance and mouthfeel. Settlers often encourage children to contribute to such tasks, fostering patience, dexterity, and sensory awareness. Fringe sources suggest children imagined each loaf as a small landscape, integrating seeds and patterns as if painting with texture. You mimic these gentle motions, feeling the quiet, meditative rhythm settle over your shoulders. You notice how ambient conditions subtly influence dough behavior. Cooler night air slows expansion, while residual warmth from nearby embers encourages gentle fermentation. Historians still debate whether settlers consciously adjusted for these subtle cues or relied on instinct, but your hands respond intuitively, folding and shaping dough to maintain optimal elasticity and texture. Across the clearing, another baker rotates loaves in a clay oven, adjusting embers to maintain gentle, even heat. Fringe observations suggest that covering loaves with cloth or leaves preserved moisture and enhanced texture, subtly guiding the final outcome. You watch the steam rising from the dough, the soft, golden crust forming gradually, while the aroma shifts from raw flour to warm, comforting bread. The scent of layered, tender dough mingles with smoke and earth, creating a cocoon of gentle warmth. Settlers relied on tactile, visual, and olfactory cues to judge readiness, cultivating quiet attentiveness that blends practical skill with meditative awareness. You press lightly into a loaf, feeling its gentle spring and warmth, a tactile affirmation of patience and careful observation. Nearby, small rolls are brushed lightly with water or leftover whey to encourage soft crusts, minor improvisations that subtly elevate texture. Fringe anecdotes suggest settlers whispered softly to their dough, turning baking into a quiet, meditative ritual. Joke 2. You replicate the motion gently, inhaling the comforting aroma and letting the repetitive rhythm soothe your mind. By the time the layered dough loaves emerge golden, softly puffed, and aromatic, the settlement is bathed in warmth, fragrance, and quiet satisfaction. The careful folding, attentive observation, and subtle improvisation illustrate how simple dough transforms into a meditative, comforting creation. Historians still debate exact methods, but the sensory and emotional impact is undeniable. As night deepens, you lean back slightly, absorbing warmth, aroma, and gentle rhythm. The deliberate folding, layering, and monitoring create a soothing cadence, quietly settling both body and mind. Settlers' patience and creativity highlight the understated charm of early baking practices. The night has grown deep and still, the settlement wrapped in the soft, gentle glow of embers, and the faint scent of baked bread lingering in the air. You trudge toward a low table where settlers are experimenting with subtle seasoning variations, folding small quantities of salt, native herbs, or even faint spices into their dough to enhance flavor. Mainstream historical accounts indicate that early Australian settlers occasionally added these minor flavorings to otherwise plain loaves, balancing taste with nutritional needs. Historians still debate the consistency and prevalence of these practices, but the soft, inviting aromas suggest careful, deliberate experimentation. You kneel beside a woman gently folding a pinch of salt and crushed native herbs into her dough, observing the way the ingredients integrate into the pliable mass. Fringe anecdotes suggest that settlers sometimes believed such small additions encouraged harmony in the loaf, a whimsical yet soothing notion. You fold and press slowly, noting the subtle elasticity and the faint aromatic lift from the herbs. Joke 1. The repeated motions, the press, fold, stretch, create a soft, hypnotic rhythm, grounding your attention and settling your thoughts. Nearby, a child sprinkles a tiny pinch of dried herbs atop a small roll, arranging them with gentle care. Settlers often involve children in these tasks, teaching patience, attentiveness, and tactile awareness. Fringe sources suggest that children sometimes imagine the herbs as tiny forests on their dough, turning baking into a quiet, imaginative exercise. You imitate the careful placement, feeling the repetitive rhythm calm your shoulders and mind. You notice how ambient factors subtly influence dough behavior. Cool night air slows hydration, while residual warmth from embers encourages gentle expansion and aroma release. Historians still debate whether settlers adjusted intentionally for these conditions or adapted instinctively, but your hands respond intuitively, folding and shaping dough to maintain optimal texture and pliability. Across the clearing, another baker gently rotates trays of herb and lightly seasoned loaves in a clay oven, adjusting embers to maintain even gentle heat. Fringe observations suggest that covering loaves with leaves or cloth preserved moisture and enhanced subtle textures. You watch the steam rising from the dough, softening the crust, while the aroma shifts from raw flour and herbs to a comforting, nuanced scent. The scent of soft bread, faintly seasoned with salt and herbs, mingles with smoke and earth, creating a cocoon of gentle warmth. Settlers relied on tactile, visual, and olfactory cues to assess readiness, cultivating quiet attentiveness that blends practical skill with meditative presence. You press lightly into a loaf, feeling gentle spring, warmth, and faint textures, a tactile affirmation of patience and care. Nearby, small rolls are brushed lightly with water to encourage tender crusts, minor improvisations that subtly elevate texture. Fringe anecdotes suggest settlers whispered softly to their dough, turning baking into a calming, meditative ritual. Joke 2. You gently replicate the motion, inhaling the comforting aroma and letting the repetitive rhythm soothe your mind. By the time seasoned loaves emerge golden brown, gently puffed, and aromatic, the settlement is enveloped in warmth, fragrance, and quiet satisfaction. The deliberate folding, attentive observation, and subtle improvisation illustrate how simple dough transforms into meditative, comforting creations. Historians still debate precise methods, but the sensory and emotional impact is unmistakable. As night deepens, you lean back slightly, absorbing warmth, aroma, and gentle rhythm. The careful folding, seasoning, and monitoring create a soothing cadence, quietly settling both body and mind. Settlers' patience, creativity, and attention to subtlety highlight the understated charm of early baking practices. A delicate hush blankets the settlement, broken only by the soft crackle of embers and the distant calls of nocturnal birds. You trudge toward a low table where settlers are experimenting with the final touch of presentation, gently scoring loaves and arranging small rolls to encourage even baking and subtle aesthetic appeal. Mainstream historical sources indicate that scoring dough, a shallow cut along the surface, allowed heat to penetrate evenly and helped control expansion. Historians still debate whether settlers approached this technique pragmatically or artistically, but the rhythm of careful scoring creates a soothing, almost meditative pattern in both dough and mind. You kneel beside a woman gently running a blade along the surface of a golden loaf, watching the delicate lines deepen as the dough yields. Fringe anecdotes suggest that some settlers imagined the scoring as symbolic, tiny maps or paths, blending practical technique with subtle storytelling. You mimic the careful motion, noticing how the tactile feedback of dough and blade engages your senses in a quietly satisfying rhythm. Joke 1. The repeated gestures, the light press, the gentle slice encourage focus and calm, creating a meditative cadence. Nearby, a child delicately arranges small rolls in neat patterns on a tray, spacing them for even baking. Settlers often involve children in these finishing touches, teaching patience, visual awareness, and precision. Fringe sources suggest children sometimes invented imaginative shapes, a crescent moon, a tiny snake, blending playful creativity with the practical task. You imitate these movements, letting the repetitive, deliberate placement soothe your shoulders and mind. You notice how ambient conditions affect final shaping. Slightly cooler night air slows dough expansion, while gentle warmth from nearby embers encourages rise. Historians still debate whether settlers adjusted scoring and placement intentionally for such effects or adapted instinctively, but your hands respond intuitively, shaping and positioning dough to balance both form and texture. Across the clearing, another baker carefully rotates scored loaves in a clay oven, observing as steam escapes from the cuts and subtle crust develops. Fringe observations suggest that covering certain loaves with cloth preserved moisture, softened crust, and enhanced aroma. You watch the gentle transformation, noting how the scored lines open slightly, releasing steam and a comforting, subtle fragrance. The scent of freshly scored, gently rising bread mingles with smoke, earth, and the lingering aroma of previous batches. Settlers relied on tactile, visual, and olfactory cues to judge readiness, cultivating a quiet attentiveness that blends practical skill with meditative awareness. You press lightly into a small roll, feeling gentle spring, warmth, and texture a tactile affirmation of patience and care. Nearby, small rolls are brushed with water or leftover whey to encourage tender, glossy surfaces, minor improvisations that subtly elevate the final product. Fringe anecdotes suggest settlers whispered quietly to their dough as a calming ritual, turning baking into a meditative exercise. Joke 2. You replicate the gentle brushing, inhaling the comforting aroma, and letting the rhythmic motions settle your mind. By the time scored and arranged loaves emerge golden brown, soft, aromatic, and subtly puffed, the settlement is enveloped in warmth, fragrance, and quiet satisfaction. The careful folding, seasoning, and final shaping illustrate how simple dough transforms into meditative, comforting creations. Historians still debate precise methods, but the sensory and emotional impact is undeniable. As night deepens, you lean back slightly, absorbing the warmth, aroma, and gentle rhythm of human activity. The deliberate kneading, scoring, and arranging create a soothing cadence, quietly settling both body and mind. Settlers' patience, creativity, and subtle artistry highlight the understated charm of early baking practices. The settlement rests in a soft, velvety quiet, punctuated only by the occasional whisper of wind and the faint crackle of dying embers. You trudge toward the final trays of bread, where settlers are performing gentle finishing touches, brushing loaves, rotating rolls, and inspecting for subtle imperfections. Mainstream historical accounts indicate that such final attention to detail was both practical and calming, ensuring loaves baked evenly and retained moisture. Historians still debate whether this meticulousness was primarily survival-driven or a quiet ritual of mindfulness, but the act of attending carefully to each loaf creates a serene, almost meditative atmosphere. You kneel beside a woman brushing a small tray of rolls with a faint sheen of water, watching the soft glint across the dough. Fringe anecdotes suggest that some settlers believed these finishing gestures imbued the bread with patience and care, a whimsical yet comforting idea. You mimic her gentle motions, feeling the tender surfaces beneath your fingertips and inhaling the comforting scent of warm dough. Joke 1. The repetitive brushing, inspection, and rotation offer a quiet rhythm, grounding your thoughts and soothing your mind. Nearby, a child lightly presses decorative indentations into a batch of rolls, creating soft patterns across the dough's surface. Settlers often encourage children to add these small flourishes, blending practical preparation with playfulness and visual creativity. Fringe sources suggest children imagine tiny stories with each indentation, turning the act of finishing bread into a gentle narrative exercise. You imitate the gentle imprints, appreciating the calming repetition and tactile connection. You notice how subtle environmental factors influence the final loaves. Cooler night air slightly slows baking, while residual heat from embers encourages gentle browning and aromatic release. Historians still debate whether settlers adjusted instinctively or consciously, but your hands respond intuitively, brushing, rotating, and observing to ensure balanced textures and gentle crusts. Across the clearing, other bakers tend their final batches, occasionally rotating trays and ensuring even heat distribution. Fringe observations suggest covering or loosely wrapping some loaves preserved moisture and enhanced aroma, a small improvisation adding comfort and subtle refinement. You watch steam rise gently, softening crusts while filling the air with warmth and faint, nutty fragrance. The scent of freshly finished bread, soft, aromatic, slightly sweet or savory, mingles with smoke and night air, creating a cocoon of quiet contentment. Settlers relied on tactile, visual, and olfactory cues to assess readiness, cultivating a patient attentiveness that blends practical skill with meditative presence. You press lightly into a small roll, feeling gentle spring and warmth, a tactile affirmation of careful care. Nearby, minor finishing touches, brushing, gentle adjustments, or repositioning rolls demonstrate settlers' patient attentiveness and improvisational skill. Fringe anecdotes suggest whispered encouragements or soft humming during these moments, creating a meditative rhythm. Joke 2. You replicate the motions, letting the gentle routine settle your mind further. By the time the final loaves emerge perfectly golden, aromatic, and softly puffed, the settlement is wrapped in warmth, comfort, and quiet satisfaction. The culmination of folding, kneading, seasoning, and careful finishing illustrates how simple bread making transforms into a meditative, soothing ritual. Historians still debate exact techniques, but the sensory and emotional impact is undeniable. As night stretches its soft darkness, you lean back and breathe in the warmth, aroma, and gentle rhythm of the settlement. The deliberate, attentive actions of kneading, folding, seasoning, scoring, and finishing have created a quiet, calming cadence, gently settling both body and mind. The settlers' creativity, patience, and subtle artistry embody the understated charm of early baking practices, leaving a sense of comfort and serenity that lingers long after the last loaf cools. The settlement is now enveloped in a profound stillness, the night fully claiming the space with a soft, velvety quiet. You settle back slightly, letting the gentle warmth of the fading embers wash over you, mingling with the lingering aroma of golden brown loaves and tender rolls. Every fold, every brush of water, every subtle scoring and rotation of dough seems to linger in the air, as though the very act of careful baking has left a gentle, invisible rhythm behind. You feel it in your own body now, the shoulders easing, the heartbeat slowing, the mind softening. Your eyes trace the shadows cast by clay ovens and scattered baking implements, softened by the flickering light. You imagine the quiet hands of settlers, moving with intention and patience, each motion a meditation in itself. There is a gentle poetry to it all, the folding of dough, the sprinkling of herbs, the faint whisper of steam rising from a warm loaf. Even the small improvisations adding a touch of syrup here, a few seeds there seem deliberate yet calming, a rhythm that mirrors the natural cadence of the night. The sensory tapestry, the warmth, the textures, the aromas, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant nocturnal calls wraps around you like a comforting blanket. You recall moments from the evening, the playful designs of children, the careful rotation of trays, the whispered encouragements to dough. Each small gesture contributes to a broader sense of quiet attentiveness, an enduring calm that persists even as your mind drifts toward rest. In this gentle, quiet, the world of early Australian settlers seems to fold into your own breath and heartbeat. Their simple acts of care, patience, and subtle creativity offer a reminder that even in necessity, there is a kind of art, a soothing rhythm that can cradle both body and mind. You feel yourself exhale slowly, letting the soft imagery and ambient warmth guide you further into relaxation. The night stretches outward, serene and unbroken, as you drift with the thought of soft loaves, golden crusts, and the tender attentiveness of long-ago hands. The story settles gently in your mind, a lullaby of simple care, patience, and quiet rhythm. Each sensory detail, the touch, the scent, the soft crackle of embers, becomes part of the ambient hum, guiding you toward deep, restful sleep. Now, let the warmth and calm linger. The settlement, the bread, the gentle rhythm of human hands all fade slowly into the background as your body relaxes, your mind softens, and the night carries you further into gentle slumber.